a former Zimbabwean government minister, Xavier Kasukuwere, who sought to challenge President Emerson Mnangagwa in upcoming elections, has been barred from contesting. A Harare High Court judge has invalidated Mr. Kasukuwere's application to contest as an independent candidate mere weeks after the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission accepted his registration papers. Lawyer Lovedale Mangwana challenged the body's decision to court, arguing that Mr. Kasukuwere was no longer a registered voter, a criterion for the candidate, as he had been living outside of Zimbabwe for longer than 18 months. Mr. Kasukuwere is key as Mugabe's loyalists, one of who served as the ZANU-PF political commissar and Minister of Youth and Indigenization in the ex-president's government. And we're now joined by political analyst Farai Muvuti to discuss these developments around the forthcoming Zimbabwean election. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, Farai. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so he's been disqualified, one of late President Robert Mugabe's commissars. What's the feedback been from the Zimbabwean public, seeing as how he could have been a major front runner to oust the current president from taking this second term?
Thank you yet again for having me. I think the feedback is threefold. You have a school of thought in which the opposition, the leading opposition party, of course, CCC, are celebrating this particular move because naturally they feel that it advantages them. Then, of course, you have the ruling party who have been mute about this, essentially, because the moment that they were asked about this and where they actually commented, they felt that he was not much of a threat. However, a sympathizer of the party, of course, then took the issue to court, and the court found the candidate in question wanting. The third school of thought, of course, is Kasukuwere's own camp, who argue that this is a consequence of fear from the regime itself, of which, of course, the argument from the government is that there is little to fear. In politics, if you don't cover all your bases, then, of course, those bases will be, if there are loopholes in your strategy, they will be exploited. And in this instance, they were, and to the favor, of course, of the ruling party.
Okay, so we're looking at the Zimbabwe courts disqualifying the former minister, Xavier Kasukuwere. We saw him flee the country after the 2017 overthrow of former President Robert Mugabe from running in next month's election. However, the reason that he has not been in Zimbabwe for the required 18 months necessary to be eligible to stand in the August 23 general elections in accordance with the country's constitution. He's responded to this and he's saying that he will file an appeal against the High Court's decision. What are the potential legal and political consequences of the court's decision and his appeal?
Well, we at the Southern African Times, we are aware that he's now, of course, filed his appeal, and that process is now under review, of which the Supreme Court itself has now accepted that particular appeal, and the legal juggernauts will begin, of course, to examine this further as the process continues. But are there any political consequences? I would say that the political consequences that are to be expected perhaps should be looked at in two ways. The first issue is that was the rule of law followed through the challenge? What is the constitutional precedence to this in as far as a constitutional standing? How does it describe the country's constitution, that is? How does it describe the due process that is to be taken? In these instances, you'd find that the first aspect of it, which is the political notions that there may be political consequences or maybe an impact, be it on the perception of the election itself, I think are not premised on good standing. The reason is this. If the Constitution itself tells you that in order for you to be a candidate in the country, you need to have at least 18 months lived in the country continuously, then I think there is nothing to argue. I think any political strategist within his team should have advised that, well, before we take this action, let's actually address this particular action, right? That's the first. The second is that in the game of politics, it's a theater of competitive ideas, but equally competing strategies. In your tactful approach to be it you are advocating for your political pursuits, if you leave any particular gap that is, that may be exploited by your political counterparts. In this particular instance, as an PF sympathizer, simply read the Constitution, understood that within the constitutional framework, this is a loophole, and exploited that particular opportunity. And as a consequence, is now in this quagmire, a quagmire that could have been avoided because the law in question was introduced during the period that he was a minister. Okay, he was a minister in 2013. That's when the law was introduced. So he should have been aware, his team should have been aware, because he does have a support base that comes, that a crop that is taken from that particular ruling class. They should have been aware and they should have prepared for it. The failure to prepare is what brought them here. What are the political consequences? I think very little. I think the clear issue here should be read for what it is. There was a loophole in his strategy and it was exploited. And the outcome is what it is now.
And you're very right. They should have found a way to cover up that loophole in order to go all the way and fulfill their political ambitions. But as it is, it seems that Kasukuwere is out of the way. And it's still being called a two-horse race now with Mnangagwa against his former 2018 rival, and that is Nelson Chamisa of the Coalition for Change. What's the likelihood? What's your thought about the two of them in the race? Who is more likely to tip towards winning come the elections in August?
Well, if you're going by a number of surveys that are quite reputable, Afrobarometer and eventually and so forth, if you're going by those surveys, they seem to be arguing that based on their own research, the incumbent, who is President Mnangagwa, has got the greater advantage. His support base has grown by at least 8%, looking at the particular outcome of the Afrobarometer survey itself and the polls in the polling that they did through the sample studies of about 2,000 civilians. Of course, when it came to looking at the confidence in government, the confidence in leadership, the confidence in and competence to lead the country, all these things pointed to Emmerson Mnangagwa. But this is not to suggest, of course, that the election will not be a tight race. The weaknesses, I think, with the opposition is the what they call the strategy of ambiguity, in which they had no clear structures, had no clear cells and branches and so forth that would enable them to coordinate, have a coordinated response and a clear alternative. Their, for example, policy ideations only came to light about 2 days ago when they released a policy review report in which they argue that this is what they're thinking from. But in as far as canvassing the population, taking the population into their confidence, creating some sense of clarity about what their political inclination is, and as far as policy is centered, that is not yet clear. Where you're getting a clear sense of clarity from a policy standpoint, from a sort of a strategic standpoint, is you're getting that from ZANU-PF. They're out there canvassing. A lot of rallies. They have been campaigning based on their track record. They've looked at the issue of infrastructure, agricultural improvement, a foreign policy that is much more open, but also fundamentally trying to tame the currency issue, which of course has its ills and the many challenges within the economic dynamic. But what they're doing, which is quite clear with the sense of clarity, is that they're telling you, these are our policies. This is what we have done so far. This is what we intend to do for the next 5 years. We're not getting the alternative vocalizing that. I think the problem with the opposition side is that their strategy of being against. So when you argue to say, well, you failed there and failed there and fail to present a clear alternative through policy, that in itself cannot convert itself to numbers in an electoral outcome that you hope to favor your side. But it's going to be a tight race, no doubt. But in terms of clarity of thought, there's one that is clear, the other not so much.
Okay, Farai, I want to take it back to your last response when you spoke about following the Constitution to a letter. Now, there's a working theory that the real electoral balance of forces was actually with Saviour Kasukuwere. It argues that in as much as electoral democracy in Zimbabwe is concerned, technicalities are one way or the other prone to become lawfare, because you can't bar someone outside of contesting when his nomination papers have been accepted. What would you say to that argument, seeing as his nomination papers were accepted and they knew that he had not been in the country for 18 months?
Well, I think that's. I think so. Let's establish the premise of the entire court case. The premise of the entire court case was based on the mere fact that he was accepted, right? And so the challenger, who is a citizen, right, took it to court and said, "Court, the nomination court has accepted Kasukuwere, whom I argue he has not been in the country or the constituency he is standing on behalf of for the last 18 months. Yet the law constitutionally says that, and the electoral law says that. But fundamentally, my rights from a constitutional standpoint will be violated because this particular clause of the law, if read alongside the two sections that were pointed out in the judgment, are not verified and equally validated by virtue of the principle of the rule of law." That's the establishment of the actual case. The law ruled in favor of this particular individual who is a ZANU-PF sympathizer. And I think it's important to get the distinction. The nullification application was not done by the ruling party, which is ZANU-PF. It was done by a sympathizer of the ruling party, which are two distinct issues. Then to the notion that, this is perhaps out of fear or out of the anxiety that Kasukuwere has some sort of support base. Well, let's establish this first. Kasukuwere has never fought in an election at this particular caliber. He's always worked on behalf of ZANU-PF. So I don't know what that argument is actually based on. If the argument was based on the fact that he had once run an election and once demonstrated his electability via standing like Nelson Chamisa. If the argument was about Nelson Chamisa and the argument was that Nelson Chamisa is being barred to run the election as a leading opposition leader who's been tried and tested, who's actually gone to an election, it would make sense. In this instance, it's a former minister who, like many others, left ZANU-PF after 2017, and when he left ZANU-PF, he settled in South Africa. After a while, he decided to come back home and run for an election. But ZANU-PF is not the first powerful, if you will, if we are to term him to be powerful, to leave the party. ZANU-PF equally had an entire vice president who never left the country, was in the country, created a political party, was touted to have military support, touted to have institutional support by virtue of having connections to the bureaucracy, and still lost emphatically. So there is no actual example. So I don't know how you can base this argument if the person in question has never been tried or tested by the electoral system or nor the electoral processes. As far as he's concerned, any electoral process he's ever encountered in Zimbabwe has been under the auspice of the ruling party. So that argument, I think, is quite faulty. But at the same time, one must accept that he does have a lot of political experience. He does have a lot of dexterity in the sense of his exposure to electoral processes during his time in the ruling party and perhaps his affinity to Mugabe. But remember, the very same party that we're talking about in the question to, as we address it, Mugabe loyalist, as it were, is the same party that Mugabe came from. So the premise, I think, is always going to be faulty. But I must concede that there are elements of it, but not the entirety of the argument, that actually makes sense.
Tricky situation there. And I wanted to get the reaction from Zimbabweans about this news. Also, just on a side, is this any topic of discussion at all? The age of the current president versus his competition, because Chamisa is only 45 years old. We know that Kasukuwere is 53 years old and Mnangagwa is about twice their age at 80 years old. Is this a topic of discussion amongst Zimbabweans at all with the youth, an older generation? What say you?
Yeah, I think so. Let me start with the latter. I think there's definitely a discussion around, the generational consensus. The opposition it's a big discussion with the opposition. They argue that we need a much younger, much vibrant, much leaner government that actually understands the dynamism of the world order and equally understands where the future lies when it comes to Zimbabwe. The other school of thought from ZANU-PF is that, well, they believe in intergenerational linkages. They believe that you don't just replace a particular old guard. You create opportunities for the youth, and they work alongside each other to create a better future because you don't want to leave anyone behind. That's their ethos. And to evidence that particular argument, what they've equally done is a number of ZANU-PF candidates that are being put forward, be it as an MPs, be it in your councillors, be it be it in the youth quota that has been introduced. A number of them are actually youthful. They're quite young, you see. So what you may find is that there's an intergenerational linkage evidenced by the fact that the MPs that are running alongside President Mnangagwa are equally young. But and as a latter point, the Kasukwere at the time, who's also a candidate, it's yet to be seen by the Supreme Court, of course, once the Supreme Court decides if he's going to continue as a candidate. But he equally argues the same thing, that, well, Mnangagwa is 80, and I think it's time for him to retire and introduce a new youthful dynamic. What I find, however, from an analytical standpoint, is that when you probe these particular arguments, one would come up with the outcome that, well, youthfulness is not a prerequisite to actually being generative in terms of your policies. So what Zimbabweans are looking for, yes, some are for that youth politics, some are for intergenerational linkages, but a lot of Zimbabwean professionals are equally for policies. Give us your policy ideas. Let the issues that lead to the particular election be issues-based, rather than the age of a candidate, because age does not mean that you have a skill set that will actually be transformative for the nation. But if you speak to policy, perhaps in that regard, people will take your stance a lot more seriously. So if you couple the age argument with policy, I think there's going to be a lot of entertaining thoughts around that. But of course, Zimbabwe is a very polarized country in as far as its political landscape. But if we're to go by what we're reading from surveys, what we're reading in terms of the national mood, ZANU-PF clearly has a leg up.
Okay, so I'm really interested in exactly how the opposition has, taking this, how far they've gone with Savior. I mean, we're looking at 9 other candidates in the polls, but it still looks as if the opposition is being riled up by his running the race. And we see this in their body language. I was looking just now, Virginia Mabiza, who is the Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs Permanent Secretary, did say that he will be arrested if he returns home because he actually has 2 outstanding warrants against him for alleged corruption and abuse of office dating back to 2019. But his team has fired back, saying that the warrants have been rendered null and void after he was acquitted of all charges by the courts. I want to know what the current situation of this is, because it looks as if he is looking to return to the country. And if he does, what would happen next?
Well, I did see that particular report that they say that he's got crime. And to be fair to Kasukwere, he did go back to the country and he answered for most of the issues that were there. He did go back, I think it was around 2017, and he went back to the country to answer for these issues. And the court did find that he was not wanting in this particular instance. Now, if there are more cases that have perhaps come to the fore, it's up to the state to evidence that. But in as far as the issues that were raised on his criminal charges, as far as I'm aware, I do not think that those issues are still prevalent. But even so, I think it would be audacious for him to confront them if that is indeed the case. He has an interest in running for presidency, and if those issues are there, it's in his interest, of course, to go and clear his name. And his lawyers have been public saying, well, there are no issues to answer for. We're willing to fight these issues. We don't think that there's anything to speak of in as far as his legal standing is concerned. So I think those are the 2 perspectives therein. But they are divorced from the political expectations in as far as the current narrative is concerned amongst Zimbabweans. Zimbabweans are more concerned about the elections. And in the elections, you have the opposition that seems to be satisfied and have no qualms with the fact that his involvement in the election has been nullified. On the ruling party side, the ruling party has simply said, well, we welcome the court's judgment and they are willing to move on. But we are undeterred whether he's in the election or not in the election. It's none of our business. He's free to do what he wants to do. That's the director of the elections, the director of the parties under PF was saying that. So I think you have a clear narrative here in which the focus is everyone is focused on their horse and building up their support base. ZANU-PF is quite confident that they'll be winning the election. Equally is CCC, the opposition party. They equally feel that they have a bigger number. They've done a lot of groundwork and they feel that they're ready to go to the elections. So I think that's what the focus is. Kasukwere is purely, I think in my own view, the issue here is that he did not cover all his bases. And I think when you go into a political contest, never allow your opponent to have one up on you, be it legal or not legal. The question is, if you're going to run a country and you expect to be taken seriously, the basic aspect is to just deal with the law that covers that particular issue when it comes to your nomination process.
A wise man said, if you're going to come for the king, you better not miss. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Farai Muvuti.